Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin in about a minute. If you'd move to your seats.
Just for the record. Oops. Okay.
Got lots of seats over on this side. Okay, let's begin. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's panel. My name is Bob Wood. I'm the Executive Vice President of AFCEA International, and on behalf of AFCEA International and USNI, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's panel, where we'll be talking about a question: are we ready to fight and win in a fully contested zone? It builds certainly on what we heard this morning from the service chiefs and their description. Actually, it started even before that. We had a kind of a breakfast meeting this morning with the N8, Admiral Kreitz, and talked about what's been submitted, what's been expected, and we'll see how it all plays out in the PB. But I'm telling you, what you have in front of you now are some very important operators with the experience, but also the responsibility to contest in that zone. We're going to be led in this discussion by a leader you probably all know well. We have Admiral, I want to say Scott Swift, but I'll call him Not So Swift because I just think it's the best name I've ever heard. Admiral Swift certainly was, we know, as the prior commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet. I first met him when he was director of the Navy staff, and in fact, Pete Daly and myself went and visited the director of the Navy staff and talked about this event and where it fit in the dialogue important to the maritime force. Got some great guidance, good support, and really we moved out from there in a way that I think has benefited this audience and these commands in a way that's really added to the combat capability and the readiness of the maritime force. And so it's great to have Admiral Swift as our moderator. He had numerous operational assignments, attack squadron commands, carrier commands, carrier strike group commands, and commander U.S. 7th Fleet, and a variety of staff positions in education, acquisition, operations, in the Navy staff, OSD, and in PACOM, where he was commander 7th Fleet. He's a thinker on the strategic level, and we talked over lunch about some of the things we heard, this morning after the presentation with the service chiefs, and I think he's going to take this discussion in a way that I think you'll find extremely informative, beneficial, and directly on our task of answering the question, are we ready to fight and win in a fully contested zone, with a great supporting cast here to answer that question. Ladies and gentlemen, you got microphones spotted around here. Think of your questions. I can guarantee you they want to hear as much from you as you want to hear from them. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel.
So thanks for the introduction, Bob. I will say that I do recall that discussion that we had in the office there in the Pentagon, and I was thinking back the last AFCEA West that I came to, and it's extraordinary. I think it was only about 2 years ago. It's extraordinary to walk around the floor today and see all that's going on. It's almost too much. You just can't take it all in as one individual. So what I hope that you were able to take in Admiral Moran's panel this morning that talks specifically about readiness. And what I'd like to do is to separate that discussion from this discussion. Bob already reminded you about what this panel is about. It's about finding and winning in a fully contested zone. But if you look beneath that in the description, it talks about how do we think, plan, and act in a way that will ensure the success, the ability to win, to fight and win and sustain ourselves in that contested zone. And I think the key to that, both the time that I've spent in the Navy and as the year and a half that I've been out of the Navy, the things that I've been doing, I think it's critically important that we think strategically, we plan operationally, and we act tactically. And what I've found is that my experience has been, not just in the military, but in industry and elsewhere, other things that I've done, that we end up thinking tactically, planning tactically, and acting tactically, and wonder why we can't get ahead in the concepts and the application of those concepts. Well, I'd remind the audience, I'm going to run through introductions here shortly, that we have some strategic thinkers on the panel here. I would invite you to look at your program to read their bios in detail, but I'm going to touch quickly to remind the audience of the unique warfighting experience that's represented on this panel, and the fact that they are living and operating at the operational level. And so that thinking strategic, planning operationally, and acting tactically is in their daily job jar. So the first two questions, I'm gonna ask them now and let you think about them as I run through the introductions. And the first one, let's answer the question up front. Are we ready to fight and win in a fully contested zone? And it's a complicated question, it's a complicated problem, and it's a complicated answer. So I'm curious to see how the panelists answer that question based on their own experiences. And the second question is, answer the question about what a fully contested zone. So if you look at Admiral White's world, his perspective of a fully contested zone may be very different than Admiral Fagan's world, and where she has been and leading for some time now. And I'm sure very different from Admiral Sawyer's world as the N3. So with that, let me run through some introductions quickly here. I mentioned Vice Admiral Fagan already. She's the commander of Coast Guard Pacific Area. I didn't have a clue what the Coast Guard Pacific Area was, despite having grown up on the West Coast, both in my childhood here in San Diego and all my Navy career has been on the West Coast, until I was the J3 at PACOM. So her responsibility runs from the Rocky Mountains all the way west to the east coast of the African continent, and from the North Pole to the South Pole. So a significant area to be concerned about across Phase 0 and Phase 2 operations. So she and her forces are engaged in a daily basis. She concurrently serves as the commander of Defense Force West and provides Coast Guard mission support to the Department of Defense and combatant commanders. So she may not be multi-hatted, but there are a lot of hats that she answers to of senior people who think that she works for them. She's served on all 7 continents, so you talk about diversity of experience, from Antarctica to the heart of Africa, and from Tokyo to Geneva. So a great span of experience to bring to the panel this morning. Phil Sawyer was an operational commander, and now he's living the dream of working in the Pentagon, and at least anybody used to be my deputy at PAC Fleet, where I actually ran the fleet. So I'm going to take great pleasure in mercilessly beating him about the head and shoulders throughout the panel today. His first tour in the Pentagon. So if you feel any sympathy for him serving there now, you can go ahead and wipe that out of your thoughts. Career submariner, he served as Task Force 74 and 54, commanding forces both in 7th Fleet and 5th Fleet. Commander Submarine Force Pacific, Deputy Commander of the Pacific Fleet, most recently the Commander of 7th Fleet, and now is the N35 on the OPNAV staff looking across on behalf of the CNO naval operations around the world. Lieutenant General Osterman comes with us with a wealth of experience. Infantry officers commanded at every level from platoon to a Marine Expeditionary Force. General officer assignments include Assistant Division Commander for both the 1st and 2nd Marine Division, Commanding General 1st Marine Division forward in Afghanistan, Deputy Chief of Staff Operations for ISAF Joint Command in Afghanistan, Commanding General of MARSOC, Deputy Commanding General of SOCOM, and his current assignment is the Commanding General of 1MEF just up the coast here in Camp Pendleton. So every commander that you see up here on the panel has been involved in some form or fashion in combat operations. I would suggest none more than Jody, and he brings a wealth of experience of the direct application in a warfighting environment in Afghanistan and Iraq to the concepts that, if you've read the Commandant's planning guidance and the Commandant's intent, brings those lessons into the Pacific theater here. Mentioned TJ. I told TJ that his introduction would probably be the longest here just because I think it's wicked cool that he served in USS Missouri as an electronics warfare officer and combat information center officer and assistant operations officer as a SWO, and then made the transition to cryptologist. And I think that's extremely important for the cyber warriors that are out there to recognize the experience that they bring as true warfighters. TJ's got a leg up of his experience there in Missouri. He became a cryptological warfare officer in 1992, assigned to Operations Directorate in the National Security Agency, so out of the frying pan and into the fire. Operation Fleet Tours include Assistant Cryptologist, Commander, U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, U.S. 5th Fleet, Assistant Chief of Staff for Information Operations, N39 and 7th Fleet, commanded the Naval Security Group activity in Bahrain and the Navy Information Operations Center. Flag assignments include Deputy Director of Tailored Access Operations and NSA. He's got a fascinating story. He's going to regale us with that experience here today. Director of Intelligence, J2, U.S. Pacific Command, Commander Cyber National Mission Force, U.S. Cyber Command, and currently commands the U.S. Fleet Cyber Command, U.S. 10th Fleet. Just an example of the kind of experience that we're getting. And to round out this group, Admiral Conn commanded at every level within naval aviation, from the squadron all the way up to the strike group level. He also commanded the Naval Aviation Warfighting Development Center in Fallon, Nevada. Nautic commanded Carrier Strike Group 4, was a director of air warfare, and then brought that experience of funding readiness to his current assignment of commanding 3rd Fleet, and the responsibility that goes with that, from certifying forces deploying forward as well as commanding forces going forward. So with those introductions, we'll start at the end, TJ, since you're down there, to this question of, are we ready to fight and win in a fully contested zone? And for the audience, we had a quick discussion about the first two questions. Really wasn't interested in a broad discussion. We could spend the whole time we have here answering that question, but just kind of a snapshot view in answering that question from each one of these leaders. So TJ.
Sir, thank you very much for the very kind words and introduction. I see some friendly faces in the audience, most of them from coalition and partner navies. So everyone else, please just hold your questions till the end. We're ready. It's a pretty direct question. I think it's a pretty short answer. In the cyberspace business, in the space business, which I'm increasingly familiar with, we are in the fight every day. If I was to offer you a fires and maneuver term, I would say that we are danger close and in continuous contact. You can read the headlines as well as I can. I can tell you it's very dynamic, it's very fast-paced. It is sometimes difficult to get to attribution, but that is the expectation. The adversary is swift. We have the capacity and capability to be swifter. I think from a maneuver standpoint and an operational standpoint, we have very good insight because of our partnership with industry and academia, but also across all the services in the intelligence community. I think we are also seeing some progress on the policy front as well. I think that in the last several months, we have seen the expectation for cyber forces, for the DoD, to support and be engaged in something which we call persistent engagement out of U.S. Cyber Command, to be ready, to be present, to be forward, to be postured, to understand what the enemy and the adversary are doing to us, where they are doing it, how they are doing it, and then partnering as appropriate with all sorts of activities below the level of armed conflict to engage. I would say we're still a little uncomfortable talking about it in public, and I think that that's okay for now. There is plenty of oversight, there is plenty of transparency, there's a very rich dialogue that happens within government with the right levels across all branches of government, so I think that we're in pretty solid ground. But we can't afford to be static, however, and I think sometimes we get caught in funding profiles. The ICT industry is not that. It moves faster than any other segment of the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base. It moves faster, plausibly, than any other part of civil society because it is so open. It is an open standard, and everyone subscribes to it. So we in the department, whether it's doing joint or DoD-wide operations or in support of defense support to civil authority, we are subject to a consumer market like no one else is. So from concrete to code, we have to move fast, and that is probably where I would say if we needed to improve a thing, it could be that thing.
Thanks, TJ. Linda?
Thank you, Admiral. So the short answer is yes, but we need to be thinking differently and more dynamically about how our assets are being used across the theater, and in particular when it comes to force packages. And I just think about the deployments that we did this past summer with Berthoff and Stratton. We had UAS, Scan Eagle, on board Stratton, and how we blend that force package and interoperate alongside our Navy peers in a way that is dynamic and different than how the adversary is able to operate. I'd also argue we really need to continue to leverage the interagency process and the other aspects of our government that have resources to bring to bear across the fight. Partnerships, they look different in the Pacific, and there are a number of key partner nations hungry for engagement and interaction with the U.S., with the U.S. Coast Guard. We have a number of peer Coast Guards in the region with Japan, Korea, India, Malaysia, peer Coast Guards and peer navies and self-defense forces who look to partner and engage with some of the authority and expertise that we bring as a Coast Guard force. And then other partners in the region, really at most basic, are looking for just partnership and capacity to enforce and ensure their own sovereignty in their exclusive economic zones. But the short answer is yes, we're ready, but we need to be thinking differently and more dynamically about how we force package and how we position, particularly in the gray zone short of conflict. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Satan?
Short answer is yes, but I think I need to open up the aperture a little bit because the guidance from my boss, Commander of Pacific Fleet, his first priority is deter our adversaries, or as Admiral Davidson says, win without fighting. And how do I do that aspect of it? Is by certifying and generating forces, combat-capable, lethal, naval, integrated forces that operate forward. And I look at where we are readiness-wise. I'm not going to get into specifics, but I look at the work that Vice Admiral Brown has done for our surface ships, and we're leaving less and less redundancy at the pier. Ships are going out full out. When I look at the work that Vice Admiral Miller has done with the readiness of our aircraft, we're in a much better place. Now, truth be told, we should be because a lot of resources have been applied to it. But we're seeing those results in terms of combat-capable, lethal naval forces going forward. The other priority is assure our allies, partners, and friends that we stand together. If you look at the Pacific, it's a big place. From Hawaii to Manila is like flying from New York to LA and back to New York. That's a lot of sea space. And it's going to be working with our coalition, our allies, our partners and friends. They're going to play a big part in that. And it's also about we can surge all our forces, but we can't surge trust. And we have various exercises. Some are live, virtual, constructive, or synthetic, that we work with our coalition partners so that we understand each other. We understand the capability they can bring to bear, and we're generating that trust out of every one of them. And the last one is if called upon, fight and win. That's what the American people expect us to do as part of the joint force. You know, I look back to my days at Nautic and some of the training environments that we were able to create there, simulation environments where you had young, trained, disciplined surface warfare officers talking with young, trained, disciplined naval aviators. You put those people in the right environment that's at a high-end level, and they start having conversations that I never had as a junior officer. I'm a firm believer from young minds come fresh ideas, and when you take those young, trained, disciplined warriors, you put them in that environment, they come up with ideas men and women over 40 aren't going to think of. And we're about 5, 6 years into this. So from a fight and win perspective at the tactical level, we are much better than we used to be. Room to grow, more work to do, but we got some fantastic lieutenants and JGs out there that are doing some good work. I think from a, getting back to the Pacific, and that geography matters in a fully contested environment. We'll get into the definition here shortly, but I guess my view would be when in a multi-domain environment where ordnance is coming from us in a multi-domain manner, and potentially ordnance coming at us from a multi-domain perspective, that would be my definition of a contested environment. Perspective sometimes is where you sit or where you sat. But to answer the question, yes, we are ready to fight and win tonight.
Thanks, Satan. Phil?
Yeah, thanks. I do think the very short answer to this is yes, we are ready to fight and win. And as the other speakers have kind of articulated, it's manning, training, equipping, and our concepts for how we'll go to how we will go to fight. The important part, and again, it's been alluded to, is there's a temporal aspect to this. We are ready now, but the other guys are continuing to try to erode away at our advantage. And it's imperative on us and actually many of the folks out there that we continually stay ahead of that, both qualitatively and to as much as possible a quantitative standpoint. And so the CNO put out in his Frago his 3 main tenets of warfighting, warfighters, and future fleet. And I think if you look at all 3 of those and take them in totality, it shows that we are on the right path in support of the National Defense Strategy, and it shows all the pieces and parts that are required to make sure that we're following the North Star, the goalpost that is the National Defense Strategy, and we stay ahead. The last part that I would add, and it's part of the warfighters aspect of it, is the part about making sure that our people not only are taken care of, critically important to the commanders, but also are absolutely best prepared to go do whatever it is our nation's going to ask us to do. And I think that there's a training part of that, clearly, but there's also an education part of that. And I think we are just now seeing that we're taking on the education portion of that. Thank you.
Jody?
Okay, sir. First off, I'd like to amend my bio as that I have never served in the Pentagon. So Phil took one for the team here on this last go-around. But the answer for me is yes, ready to fight and win also, without a doubt. You know, the last 18 to 20 years, essentially the Marine Corps has become a second land army because our nation asked us to do that. So fighting alongside the U.S. Army and very terrestrial based in terms of our Afghanistan and Iraq mission sets. I have to point out that we have transitioned from that. We are now back to our expeditionary roots, which allows us to get after the near-peer fight that the defense planning guidance has talked towards. So, you know, instead of being, a second land army that can also go on ships, we're now a naval force that can go ashore when required. And so a very distinct difference in mindset and the way that that's all come about. That's been further refined with the Commandant's planning guidance. For anybody that hasn't read that, that is our way forward, and it's what's going to refine our ability to not only currently win and fight, but also in the future to maintain the decisive edge, because as Admiral Sawyer mentioned, the enemy gets a vote. They get a chance to get better, and we've got to stay that much better than they are. So with force design changes associated with that, naval integration, for me personally, it's working with Admiral Conn and 3rd Fleet to be tied at the hip on no longer the operational forces of the Marine Corps, but the Fleet Marine Forces, back to our old nomenclature, which defines us as soldiers from the sea, which is exactly what we are in terms of the naval integration aspect. I would say in terms of the readiness to fight and win there, oriented on the multi-domain fight that we'll probably talk about a little bit later. And most importantly, as an expeditionary force, being able to fight and win inside the enemy's weapon engagement zone. So we fully expect to be within the range of those weapons that the enemy may bring to bear, but being able to be that contact layer in order to allow the surge activity that's required, but long and short of it is to win that complex fight. So back to being our crisis response expeditionary force that's capable of responding immediately against the nation's adversaries.
So a couple thoughts run through my mind. One is to Jody's point of Fleet Marine Force. I was fortunate when I was at the PAC Fleet Commander to serve with some pretty incredible leaders. Bob Brown with Army Pacific, Shags O'Shaughnessy, Air Force Pacific, and General Berger as MAR 4PAC. And we came up with a concept between the two of us of doing combined commanders conferences. And so he brought in the 1MEF and the 3MEF commander and the other principals, and he would do a MAR 4PAC commanders conference, and we would plan it to be adjacent to the PAC Fleet commanders conference. And then we would, depending on the agenda, we'd do a day or a day and a half together, and we would host it in my spaces, what was my spaces at PAC Fleet. And as good hosts, you have the name tents. You know, that's the critical thing. I mean, your team's doing a great job here and making sure that we have all this right. So I had MAR 4PAC, and those damn Marines, you know, especially when there's Navy in the room, they go off on their own. They've got their own plan. And wouldn't you know that that General Berger would bring his own name tent? And there it was, General Berger, FMF PAC, to send a message to all those Marine commanders that reported to him that this was a naval force that we needed to bring together. And then listening this morning, once again, to General Berger mentioned that this was a temporal question, as you mentioned, Phil, that it's not just counting numbers, it's not just beans and bullets, it's the experience that we have as warfighters and the fact that we can delegate authority. And then I was struck by CNO's comments along that same context. So I think we're very blessed with the leaders that we have today, that the opportunity has presented itself, and you're seeing an aligning within the force that's backed up by budget and is reflected in the comments that were made here. Satan, you addressed the question already. I'll start with you, and then I'll run down to TJ and come back about what exactly is this contested zone? You answered it already. Anything else to add to that, or move off to TJ?
Well, I think we all have to, particularly, and TJ, maybe you'll get it after this, electrons know no borders. And potential cyber effects leaving ships at pier, where they can't even get into the fight. So I think you have to think of some of these contested zones globally. And be able to have the defensive system in place to be able to deal with that. The only other thing that I would add, you know, I kind of talked at the tactical level with our various warfighting development centers. It's more than Nautic and Schmidic. There's the Undersea Warfighting Development Center. There's the Information Warfighting Development Center. And they all are doing good work and are moving out. But I also look at what CSG 4 and 15 have done, and being able to create a training environment where you can stimulate training from the operational commander down to individual level operators. And I think that's very important in a contested environment, particularly in the way we're going to operate, integrated and in some cases interdependent. That you see something in training before you see it in combat. Because if you do not, you're going to pause or guess. And that's not the outcome we're looking for. So I'll stop there, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Satan. So TJ, to Admiral Conn's comment, to riff off that a little bit, the importance of all domain fires, inbound and outbound, as you have thought through your answer to this question, I'd be grateful if you would talk about the IWC concept and where you see it, that we've now got an IWC warfare commander that is resident within the strike group commander staff to look over that domain of warfighting and how we're progressing there. But over to you.
Yes, sir, happy to do that. And begging your indulgence, I'll probably give some preparatory remarks and then close with the IWC at the end as sort of the capstone argument. So in the space that I occupy daily, space, the high ground, cyberspace, the everywhere ground, I would say that that's kind of the fastest fight. There's something that seems a little ephemeral about that. Satan and the other number of fleet commanders, the Integrated Maritime Force, which is 1st MEF, 3rd MEF in the Pacific, they require that we connect and bind the fleet so that they can do effective sustainment, that they can do effective and safe maneuver, that they can do that with confidence from underneath or outside the enemy's time zone or decision space and sensor grid. So that's the fight that we are in and day out. We don't have the luxury to fight tonight. We think we're in it today, so we have a lot to learn. It seems to be a little transient, and I think that's part of the struggle we have, which points then to the establishment of the Information Warfare Commander afloat. So we've had great success at the strike group level. One of the 4 warfare commanders reporting directly to the strike group commander, and I think that that's a program now in its 4th year, post Major Command 06s across the Navy's information warfare community. They bring with them 24 to 26 years of experience in not only every facet of information warfare in the Navy, but because a lot of them by that juncture will have been fully joint qualified, they're bringing a lot of experience with the joint force, which then gives them some pretty experienced aperture in the all-domain fight. So it really is about how do you prepare and integrate with the strike group and the OFRP, and then how do you as a commander understand sometimes you are supported, sometimes, well, you're always supporting, sometimes you're supported, and then how do you enable the strike group commander as part of DMO to carry their fight as they see fit. I think we do understand that space, that's a large gravity well to get there and to be effective. And it's going to typically take nation states, not just to get there for things like communications, industry is very good at that, but to achieve effects in space, you're likely talking nation states that are in the wherewithal of doing that. So we need to understand what they're capable of. The Information Warfare Commander is to enable the strike group commander to do maneuver as he sees fit for his fight, exercising mission command with the O plan that carries forward from the number fleet, the maritime component, and the joint force commander.
Thanks, TJ. Linda, as you share your view on that contested zone, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on what collaborative activities that your forces are conducting. I'm thinking of driftline fishing collaborative efforts with the Chinese. So this isn't all about confrontation. It's really a competition, and a competition isn't necessarily a bad thing. Plus the things that you are doing kinetically in the theater as well. I just noticed a Coast Guard PC in San Diego Harbor the other day, first one I've seen in CONUS. It seems they're all deployed over in Fifth Fleet and doing great work there. So it might be useful to expand a little bit on what your forces are doing there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so where I want to go is regions where we should be looking at for a force projection standpoint. And I would go to those regions where we've got someone who's projecting power that challenges international norms and rule of law. Right? That's really where the interest needs to lie. From a Coast Guard perspective, we look beyond the defense role that our DoD counterparts, and we look at it from a security and an economic perspective as we look at what are contested zones. So the Eastern Pacific. We did do an offload of the Monroe, did a drug offload just 3 weeks ago. 79% of the drug flow into North America is coming through the Eastern Pacific, off the coast of South America, through the transit zone and into the arrival zone in Mexico. Cost to the economy, $193 billion in crime and health and safety and productivity loss to those narcotics that are coming towards our shore. And so, TCOs are using that vector to spread corruption and instability. And I would tell you for the Coast Guard, that is, we are conducting that mission now. It is a 365, 24/7. We are out there every day looking to interdict and counter that security and economic threat to the United States. Another area of focus, the Arctic, from a contested area. $3 billion of economic impact to the Alaska seafood industry, 90 billion barrels of undiscovered oil, 30% of the world's natural gas in the Arctic, and estimates are $1 trillion in rare earth and minerals and zinc, lead, etc. Polar Star, my first unit, and I will add it was not a new unit when I first reported to it in the mid-'80s, 44 years old and is en route home port from New Zealand as we speak. So as we look at the Arctic, the increasingly open water in the Arctic, China's interest, having declared themselves as a near Arctic state, Russia's interest, and as they have built up and increased their military presence on their side of the Arctic, the Polar Security Cutter then becomes critical to establishing on the water presence in our claims to the Arctic and ensuring our own national sovereignty. And then to the Admiral's question with regard, so collaboration, that is one of the things that the U.S. Coast Guard does exceptionally well. There is a forum, it's called the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. There's a comparable one in the North Atlantic. North Pacific Coast Guard Forum is comprised of Russia, China, Japan, Korea, Canada, and the United States. As a Coast Guard, we have and continue to have a dialogue between the U.S. Coast Guard and China Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard and Russia Border Guard, talking about shared interests, search and rescue, maritime boundary challenges in the Bering, and particularly with China, the challenge of illegal and unregulated fishing, which is rampant in the Pacific, and there are a number of countries who are particularly guilty of that. But so having that collaborative system and ability to talk through the problem set has been really key and important to us. So finally, just again, those areas where we can offer a counterpoint. And then, in some of the smaller Pacific Island nations, and this, as I said earlier, this is about then capacity and expertise, and to ensure that they're able to enforce their own sovereignty in their exclusive economic zones. For many of these small countries, it's kind of an existential reality for them. The fish stocks and fish proteins really provide security for each of these nations. But in the short of conflict, competitive space where partnership and expertise and engagement and the rule of laws-based open order is really how we view the Pacific region. Thank you.
Thanks. Phil? Contested zone?
Yeah, contested zone. So I think it's very helpful to have the speakers that just talked, because I'm going to leverage off of a little bit of them. So first of all, it's all domains, right? Space, cyber, and all the things that we normally think of from a military standpoint, from a kinetic standpoint. But the other interesting part, I think, is that there are different phases of the conflict, if you will, that's going on in all these different domains at the same time. As Linda just mentioned, if you're a Pacific Island nation out there, security is number one. Your fishing stocks, your proteins, hugely important. And you think you're in something what we would term greater than phase zero, so phase 0+. We might not see it that way, but that's the important part about the way I think what fully contested means, and that is all domains, different phases in different areas. And the other part that I think is relatively new, and new being, the past decade or so, is that there's not the same kind of geographic constraints that we, in the past, kind of thought of when we started talking about conflict. And that's because of cyber and space, right? I can be, somebody in a place in a continent way far away and have an impact on an electrical grid or a banking system or the variety of things that we know that we've seen have occurred. And then the last part from the purely the kind of the other military perspective that I think of is when we talk about contested zones, in my mind what that conjures up is that every inch of ground or sea that I'm going to have to move into, it's going to be contested. There's going to be something or somebody there that's going to try to keep me away from that. I am not going to have initially the superiority and certainly not the dominance that I desire, and certainly not the superiority or the dominance that perhaps our recent past has shown us that we would have in some aspects of a fight. And so I think that makes it completely different than our most recent experience, and thus the importance of great power competition and making sure we're keeping our eye on that ball as we move forward. Thanks.
Jody?
Okay, hey, funny thing is, and it's a really good news story, is that almost had the exact same things written down as Admiral Sawyer had. And just to expand on those a little bit, the multi-domain fight in different phases is really something I've been driving home with the MEF because, where you may be in a phase 0, you're not in any physical contact with somebody. I mean, and even today, we're in phase 3 with some of our adversaries in the cyber domain. I mean, we're duking it out every single day. So it's one of those things of trying to get, in my case, the Marines to understand they can be in different places in different domains all at the same time. And that really is kind of a change in the way that we've been thinking. And to the point about the global aspect, if you look at the defense planning guidance and the 2+3 aspect of it, long and short of it is if we get into a conflict type situation associated with Russia or China, you're liable to have somebody else there that's going to try and be an opportunist on the backside of that. So as a Marine Corps, we're looking at not only having conflict, but then also simultaneous competition elsewhere as somebody tries to take advantage of that. To the point about kind of a supremacy, superiority aspect of it, as Admiral Sawyer touched on, I really sincerely believe with our near-peer adversaries, they'll have roughly the same capacity, roughly the same capability, roughly the same lethality as we will. So the only thing that we're going to have as a decisive advantage is going to be that ability to get inside the OODA loop, and this was mentioned in an earlier briefing as well, but how quickly we can get through that decision-making cycle, because it feeds into that temporal nature of what this contested zone is all about. And frankly, you got to be acting quicker and be more capable in working in that environment to achieve superiority when you need it, because again, as mentioned, we won't have supremacy like we've had for most of the history of our nation, frankly.
So a couple of thoughts as I've been listening to the panelists, and I think Admiral Conn mentioned this, that it's important to think globally. So while the focus of the fight may be regionally, we can't take our eye off broader conflicts that could occur tangential to what the focus might be, and that was brought up by CNO earlier this morning. Secretary Work talked about the importance of peer competitors out there, and near peer has been a part of our vernacular for some time, and there are specific areas that you can say, yeah, we still have overmatch here or overmatch there, but taken in total, my personal view is that China certainly is a peer competitor, and if you take this context of the other near peers that are out there, multiple players from Russia to North Korea to Iran and others, they very well could take an opportunity with the U.S. Focused in one area to act out in other areas, which takes us to a point that Jody brought up, and I know this is front and center in both the CNO's and Commandant's mind, and that is it's important to think asymmetrically and out of phase, that agility is key to winning a warfight with a peer competitor, and that agility comes from the ability to delegate authority, and that authority comes from a foundation of training and experience, and that we exercise that on a daily basis, which is what I see in the leadership that these leaders are exercising on a daily basis. I was going to ask a question, and I'm going to answer it myself in the interest of time. And Phil, I'm going to give you the last question, and because I want to get to the audience questions, and I notice we only have a half hour left. So if people want to move to the microphones, it'll speed the process of stepping through the questions. And so we, as I mentioned, Admiral Moran ran a readiness discussion. But with your experience of having already served successfully at this level, and now you're in the Pentagon, I get at the 3 and the 5 level, you're not deeply steeped in the budget piece, and perhaps stepping into Jody and Satan's area, you know, given the budget constraints that the CNO and the Commandant, both Commandants spoke about, and the sophisticated systems that people tend to think that are necessary to win in this war fight. What's your sense as you sit in the Pentagon about our ability to make sure that we are aligned from a funding perspective to get after those things that the ladies and gentlemen that relieve these commanders here and are facing the same challenge that your predecessor faced? Before I get to that, the question that I was going to ask is, as a joint force, you know, what makes naval forces so unique? And I was doing some studying and some of the other things that I've been doing, and ran across a piece of data that I'd never seen before. And it was relevant to me as a retired naval officer, and less than 1% of the Pacific is land. So the question, I think, amongst strategic thinkers, military strategic thinkers, and operational planners is, where are we going to fight to? And then once we get there, how are we going to fight from that space, regardless of what domain it's in? And you see that throughout the Commandant's intent and the Commandant's planning guidance. You see it in SecNav's papers that he's been putting out, and you see it in documents that the CNO continues to publish. So Phil, from your perch there in the Pentagon, as you look at the budget development, what's your sense of, you know, the OPNAV understanding where the fleet is and where we need to go in building the budgets that provides the resources to continue the success that we've enjoyed so far in the last year or so?
Yeah, thanks. I'm the perfect guy to ask a question about the budget. I sincerely appreciate that one. And so I think I'm going to answer your question from this aspect, Admiral. We have a national defense strategy, and strategy really is about choices. You have to be able to prioritize, and you have to figure out what is most important, and then just kind of work your way down. And though you may love something that ends up below the line, you have to make hard choices. And that means those things don't make the final cut, if you will. And so I think it's critically important that we have a North Star, the goalpost to aim for, and that is our national defense strategy, and focuses on our long-term strategic competitor being the PRC. And so with that as kind of you know, where we're headed, it helps the Pentagon with support by all the fleets and everyone else that is here to help on that. It helps keep us grounded because we keep looking back to, okay, that's where we're headed. You know, I heard the story. There's a plane that's flying and it gets a thunderstorm, right? And so the pilot diverts. Okay, well, the thunderstorm makes you divert for a short period of time, and then you get back on your course. So the world gets a vote, right? Things occur that may draw our attention away for a period of time, but once that thunderstorm's gone by, you got to get back on the course. And so strategy requires choices, and I feel very confident, knowing what I do know in the short period of time I've been in the Pentagon, that that the teams there, and it is a naval team. It's the Marine Corps and the Navy are taking hard looks at across the board of what we need for the future fleet, and are providing the right amount of resources to that. Now, there's always room for more, right? We never have enough, but that said, given what we've got, we are making very, very tough choices, and I think in the right direction.
Thanks for that, Phil. All right, let's get to questions. If someone has a question, have some courage and step up to the mic. And I would just remind we've got a wealth of diverse experience up here in the panelists. So fire away. Yes, sir.
I'd be interested in the panel's views, if you look in your crystal ball, say 10 years out, of the roles of new or extrapolations of existing technologies in how they will affect how we contest those contested spaces. Thinking about things like artificial intelligence, unmanned vehicles, hypersonic missiles, directed energy weapons, things that are today technologically and scientifically on the horizon, but not yet really deployed. Do you see any of those making significant change 10 years out about how we do business?
Anyone want to jump on that?
Sure.
Jody?
I'll jump on that. You know, first to mention, when I talk about the Commandant's planning guidance, it is a 10-year mark. So it is actually a 10-year vision for achieving that. From the technological perspective, I'm a firm believer, if you look at history, as lethality increases, you have to disperse the forces further. You know, think of Civil War, you know, line battle, and it runs up against a machine gun in World War I, and if you don't disperse, you're going to have incredible losses. So we're in that mode right now, and so I think to the lethality of the weapon systems, we'll find it even more and more of a dispersed force out there, which challenge our command and control, our survivability, our offensive capability, et cetera. I think the one constant is the individual Marine or sailor that's out there, and so probably see a requirement in the multi-domain aspect of having to invest more and more into that individual. And I think from an AI perspective, machine learning perspective, when you think about what I just talked about in terms of the decision cycle really coming down to being the deciding factor associated with common capability, capacity, and lethality, decision cycle being it, that AI and machine learning will play very, very heavily into that. So I think that's kind of where I would see that. The only adjunct I put on there is manned and unmanned teaming. If I can get an unmanned aircraft to turn a 21G turn to take down somebody off of the rear end, then all the better. But how do you get those manned and unmanned teaming situations where you can take them to advantage?
Just a couple things. One, I think we need to continue to look at resourcing the levels for our maritime operations centers. We're going to fight the high-end fight at the fleet level. And the Maritime Operations Center is the weapon system that the fleet commander uses to drive down actions down through the numbered fleets and into the individual tactical units, task groups. Anything that, whether it's called the OODA loop, that can speed quicker decisions and more lethal actions, I'm all in. Anything that can provide overmatch that can drive simplicity down to the tactical level, I'm all in. Because I think the more complex tactics that you have, the more difficult they are to pull off in the fog of war, particularly in a highly contested environment. I'm not going to get into specific what those type of overmatch capabilities are. Generally, I'd say better headlights. I want to see further. All right, and as far as I can see, I want to shoot something. And once I make the decision and shoot it and pull the trigger or push the bottom, I want it dead now. Or hit now. So I think the speed matters. And when I think from a tactical CSG perspective, I think about operational reach. How far can I get away? To be able to use maneuver on my terms, to be able to put my capabilities in someone else's backyard. So that's where my mind is right now.
TJ?
Just a couple of thoughts on that. I think artificial intelligence You know, for the last 30 years, it's always been 10 years away. I don't know if it's going to be here 10 years from now, but it's going to be a lot closer. I don't think it's going to be necessarily fully instantiated yet in the way that we imagine it. I do think augmented human decision-making with some sort of compute and analytic engine underpinning that is likely to be here in ways that we don't fully anticipate. And we ought to get ahead of that and thinking about, in the context of a more dispersed force, and Satan, with some of your requirements to have better headlights, to have better lethal decisions, how we're going to empower a force which might have to operate in a disconnected fashion or in isolation so that they can do the best decision-making possible. I think you know, some of the leaders up here have talked about the value of young Marines and young sailors. They will come, I believe, with an ability to deal with ambiguity with a little bit more comfort than we do because of their access to data and the way that they will assimilate that than I am currently able to do in my advanced decision-making. So how we will empower them and be comfortable as leaders in giving them clarity and also having some confidence with a little less control. Not less command in the context of mission command, but a little less control. And that'll be uncomfortable space for leaders and decision makers to be in. One of my good colleagues, Steve Perot, recently introduced me to a term which he used called the lethality boundary. And that's just basically where we as leaders will think we will be with unmanned autonomous systems, not just sensor platforms, but also armed, and where we will insist as society and as professional warfighters that the human decision maker is in the loop. And we probably could spend a little bit of time thinking more and more about that. And then last, not to go on too long, we do not currently have a good vision of just how much bandwidth we will require to do autonomous, over the leading edge warfighting. It's going to require a hell of a lot and a lot more than we're thinking about now.
Bob? Well, while Bob's stepping up to the mic, what I would just offer a word of caution on technology is that as I've thought more and more about this, I see technology as an enabler, not as a solution. And invariably, when people bring technology into a dialogue with me, it usually has tactical implications. And my first thought is, how does this help my operational planning, and how do I think strategically about the application of this technology? So as you've heard these commanders discuss, oftentimes it's a horizontal discussion, and I think it's really important to turn it into a vertical discussion about all domains and at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. But Bob?
Perfect segue, sir. I wanted to talk about space, the contested domain of space, and I know that isn't necessarily the component that we see up here, but it's a requirement in that overmatch, it's a requirement in seeing over the horizon, it's a requirement in the operational agility of the maritime force. And I think of the Coast Guard, I mean, looking from where you go, I mean, it's got to be something you worry about or think about. So it is contested, it went away today, just heard it's all gone, we don't dominate there anymore. What does it mean to really lose dominance in space? What do you think about when you add space into your worries?
So the space world is moving fast. We actually have a space commander up here. TJ, you want to talk a little bit about where we are in
Yes,
that
sir.
domain from a Navy perspective, and if you want to expand and to join as well.
So as the naval component to U.S. Space Command, the nation's newest combatant command, I can tell you I am increasingly impressed with what they can do in space, a lot of which I wasn't really aware of. The Navy role in that is largely as operate some buses that are on orbit to provide bandwidth and communications capability to not only the Navy Maritime Force, but also the Joint Force. But as we become better integrated with the role in space and with what General Raymond is doing, it is impressive with what U.S. capabilities are and allied capabilities are. Again, the full spectrum of capabilities, which you have to be pretty careful in talking about that. But what's not impressive, unfortunately, or I guess is equally impressive, is what other nations are able to do as well. It is definitely contested space. So we are thinking hard about what a new combatant command means, what a new uniform service means, what the demand for us will be. We have a professional space cadre in the U.S. Navy. We probably will need to strengthen that and make it more resilient. I would be loath to lose those billets and bodies and capabilities to another service, but it is yet as undecided. I do think, though, sir, in a distributed force for distributed maritime operations to deliver what Satan requires for the strike group level, it is going to begin in space, and it's going to be first mover advantage is going to be key.
Thanks, TJ. Any, Wes?
Good afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Andrew Poulin here in San Diego. My question, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper in the role of allies and partners. I wonder if you could speak to which allies and partners you see as critical to the fight, and more importantly, what steps are we taking to kind of ensure that high level of interoperability?
So I'll go ahead and start. This year is a RIMPAC year, Rim of the Pacific exercise. We have up to 29 partner nations participating. 1971, there were 3. We have 29 partner nations ready to participate this summer. That's over 40 ships, over 200 aircraft, about 25,000 people. That falls in my operating together, building relationships, generating trust with, and they're all in the Pacific region, but some of them are from Chile. And various nations across the Pacific. I just came back from New Zealand 2 weeks ago where we had the Commanders Conference. And we had over 100 people in New Zealand, which is a pretty cool place if you can get there, on a 12-hour flight from San Francisco to Auckland, which speaks to the geography of this Pacific. But we have exercises going on all the time. But I just serve RIMPAC as one that's probably the most robust in the Pacific from my vantage point.
Linda?
So, agree completely. You know, RIMPAC, something we as the U.S. Coast Guard participate in. I mentioned a number of the key nations in the region where they've got sort of. So for many countries, right, they may call it a navy, but they actually they're functioning and their authorities are more comparable to the U.S. Coast Guard. But a number of key peer partners in the region: Japan, Korea, India, a number of others. There are other countries, and I'll use Indonesia as an example, who have are working to put together their Coast Guard, a Coast Guard modeled on ours, with the full suite of authorities and capacity. And we we've Coast Guard members in and out of Indonesia regularly to help the Indonesians build that capacity. But I'd point to another example where the partnership really becomes kind of comes to fruition. We have 11, soon to be 13 bilaterals with a number of countries in the region in the realm of these fisheries shipwright agreements. So Cook Islands, Kiribati, RMI, FSM, Nauru, Palau, Samoa. Another example of the kind of regular, sort of repeatable, predictable partnership and engagement that provides value to countries. We are planning for some additional deployments into the Pacific, Blue Pacific 2020, and one of the deployments will use our new fast response cutters and some 225-foot buoy tenders to provide some capacity to the small island and partner nations in a region in a way that is more predictable. And I'm often reminded by my field commander in Hawaii that in the region, a little bit that's enduring is much more significant than one big act, and then you don't come back for 5 or 6 years. And so we're working on very targeted where we can make sure we are partnering with the right right set of partner nations. Thank you.
So Phil, from the 7th Fleet perspective, PAC Fleet perspective, and now wearing the N5 hat at OPNAV as well.
Yeah, so, and I'll make this somewhat generic, but allies for us are indispensable. right? We're not going to war. We're not going to conflict without allies. We haven't done it in the past. We're not going to do it in the future. Every ally or partner brings something different to us. Some bring us capacity. Some bring us capability. Some who may just go to RIMPAC and exercise bring us planners. All that matters. All of it's important, right? You stitch together the whole cloth to become as potent and as lethal as you possibly can. And I think that more and more from our, I'll say, our long-term allies, we're kind of getting past the point of being interoperable and moving to the idea of being interchangeable. And you will see this in the very near future when you see one of our strike groups operating with another Navy ship for not only COM2X, not only the training period, but throughout the deployment, right? So interoperable, in my mind, that's now, do I have the right communication gear that talks to the other communication gear, and do I have the same pubs and crypto and all that stuff? But interchangeable is really where we want to get. And we are on that path to get there with many of our allies.
Yes, sir.
Retired Sergeant Major, I'd like to talk about the 9-dash line. And I realize that the Chinese Coast Guard is escorting their fishing boats along inside the 9-dash line of Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines. And I'd like to know what the Coast Guard is going to do, if they are going to do anything. And I'd like to know about what the Navy's role is inside the 9-dash line where Taiwan is located, or any explanation you can give us about the 9-dash line. So I don't know who wants to take this on. I know Lieutenant General Osterman does not need to do this, but the Coast Guard or one of the other admirals might be able to address the 9-dash line.
I defer to him.
So, Jody, any comments for the audience? What I'd like to do is recognize, first of all, that the leaders up here aren't going to make a decision about what they do with respect to China.
I
But
totally understand that.
let me answer ask the panelists to answer the question in this way, and Linda, I would ask you to go first. First of all, with your extensive background of understanding law of the sea,